Hi there, I'm Joyelle McSweeney, and I'm talking to you from South Bend, Indiana. This is where I live. It's right smack dab in the middle of the country, pretty much. We don't know where Indiana is or South Bend. And it's really my pleasure to talk to you a little bit today about Flet. So, Ben asked me, he talked a little bit about what you've been reading, and he asked me to contextualize Flet in terms of what maybe I was reading or thinking about when I wrote that book, or what I see as some of the sources for that book. The number one source for writing Flat was actually not a book at all. It was the experience of living through Hurricane Katrina. So I lived in Alabama. I was teaching at the Alabama MFA, and so we were a few hours inland. We were in Tuscaloosa, so a few hours inland from the Gulf Coast when Katrina hit. And where we hit it, where we lived, it was just a terrible storm. Trees came down. It was dangerous for a while. It was nothing like what the Gulf Coast experienced. However, within a matter of days, the whole landscape of Tuscaloosa, Alabama changed because it became a very militarized place. We would see military convoys going by. We would see prison buses going by, and some of them were actually full of prisoners who had been evacuated, but many of them were full of refugees who were now sort of in the hands of the state and in a kind of we were all living in sort of a militarized space. And then as the time went by, you would hear other news reports. So in addition to the great loss of life that was happening along the Gulf Coast and the damage that was happening along the Gulf Coast, there was also this militarization. And then the next phase was to hear these reports of the corporatization of the catastrophe. So, for example, the city school systems were all shut down, and all the school children were obviously refugees. But then rather than work towards rebuilding that public school system, there was talk of setting up these virtual schools. And the software for these virtual schools was actually written by a relative, or it was a corporation that was providing these virtual schools, was being provided by a relative of Laura Bush. And of course, W was the president at the time. So for me, on top of all the other very obvious losses that Katrina brought about and all the inequalities that it brought so glaringly into light, there was also the sense that there would be no public space, that there would not be real rebuilding, that there was a sense that this common space of the school was like totally expendable, and that there was really a shock doctrine phenomenon going on whereby catastrophe created this opportunity for profit and for the privatization of what should have been a public or common space. And so you could say in a kind of hilarious way that and I did say when I was writing Flet, well, I'm writing a sci-fi novel about education policy, which sounds like a ridiculous and dry thing to write a sci-fi novel about. But this is why it mattered to me, because of Katrina. And why it continues to matter to me. Katrina was also a real wake-up call for me for the ways in which the corporate supplants the government and you're not looking, and the ways in which economic and environmental catastrophe stand in for each other and are inextricable. So that's what was going on. That really was the big push to write Flet. And I just wrote out of my grief and a kind of a numbness that would turn over into grief and turn back into numbness. And I think you can see that in the tone of the book. But also taking the question a little more literally and thinking about the actual literary forebears. I think one interest that I really have in terms of genre is the very compressed lyric narrative, the very short narrative that it's short enough, like from novella length to short novel, that you can see all the parts of it at once. So my first experience with this kind of length narrative would be, for example, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I read in high school. I really liked how you could pick it up and you could see all the parts of that story at once, because it was short enough to hold in your mind, but also the very, very memorable sentences that I seem to have carried with me ever since high school. And so I like this length for the combination of you can grasp the entire form, and then you can also focus on the sentence. And when I set out to write my book, Flet, this is going to sound crazy, but I decided to make the plot as conventional as possible. Like this whole idea of this kind of government flunky main character who finds out the government might be lying to her, who has to decide whether or not to trust her mentor, and finally just like goes through to the other side. I know that is a convention of both sci-fi books and movies. And I was not trying to innovate on that convention. On the contrary, I was trying to use those conventions like in the way that a poet uses the conventions of the sonnet so that was my armature, and then I could do as much innovative and play with the language as I wanted to. I mean, even the fact that this main character's name is this sort of weird verb, maybe in the past tense, flet, it's not, it's sort of like not even functioning properly as a noun at all, shows how my interest in what I could do with the syntax was just my primary interest, and I wanted the plot arc to be very conventional so that that was not the primary concern of the reader as the reader read along. So some other influences on this book would be The Crying of Lot 49 and Play It As It Lays, which are both fantastic California road trip novels, very short with female protagonists. Joy Williams' excellent sort of flat, fantastic book, Changeling, which you haven't read it, makes an amazing turn in the last third. It goes from being a kind of Play It As It Lays, kind of flattened, kind of 70s kind of woman, flattened yet fantastic story happens to her, and right at the end everyone starts turning into animals. So I think that straight up influenced me to have Flet turn into this desert fossil at the end. And then some movies like Jetty by Chris Marker, the memory sequences in Hiroshima No More. So in Hiroshima No More happens in Hiroshima, but then there's these long memory sequences that happen in France that happen again and again in slightly different ways. And I think the flat fantastic really influenced me. And Kate Bernheimer's novels that are also these like fairy tale novels that are, they have the armature of fairy tales and the motifs of fairy tales, but they have these absolutely alienated female subjects that move through them. And because they're so flat and they're alienated, they strangely work as receptors for a lot of aesthetics to assemble around. And I think that's very moving to me. And finally, if there's one thing that influenced me in writing the sentences themselves, it would be Joyce. So that's like such a huge, broad thing to say, but I read Joyce a ton in college and after college and grad school, and I just feel like once you've read Joyce and you see how much you can build using sound as your main urgency, it's pretty hard to go back. And so I think permission to make such sonically intricate sentences and to write whole passages that are organized around sound came from Joyce, even though I'm not really interested in writing a huge big book of any sort. But I think the permission to sort of create these sonic patternings and to do narrative work with that came from Joyce. So those are some answers about Flet. And then in recent years, since Flet, I've read Anna Kavan's Ice, and I feel like that is so similar to Flet that I feel like I was occultly influenced by that book, even though I haven't read it. And since I'm guessing that you are all really interested in this genre of the compressed narrative that allows for lyric and aesthetic baroqueness in some cases, I would really recommend all the short works of Cesar Aira, the Argentinian writer. My favorite is Ghosts, which is this outlandish farcical story about guys on a building site and ghosts that come to the building site while these migrant workers are working on luxury condos. And is usually held to be an allegory for the disappeared